Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm hanging out with my friend Kat from the Creative Introvert. Kat is here to help me aggregate all of your questions throughout the year that you leave in the chat box. And then we put together these little Q&A episodes. You all know Kat by now. A lot of you do anyway. So thanks for being here today, Kat. What do we got?
Yeah, thanks. Today we're going to be talking about basically planetary placements in the chart, not talking about planets in particular signs, but just how they are literally geographically like in the chart. So one of the things that you've been talking about in recent videos with the different transits that are happening right now is the difference between the superior and inferior aspects. And I guess, would you just be able to give us a little bit of an explanation about what you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's probably one of the most popular questions I've received in the past few weeks on the year, really, because um, in the work that I did on some of those election charts, on Joe Biden's chart, on Trump's chart, and just some of the way that I've been working with the transits in November, we had a series of aspects from Mercury in Libra overcoming Saturn, or in the superior square to Saturn, Venus in the superior square to Saturn, really today, this week. So people have been like, wait, what is this? So first of all, the first thing to say is that this way of looking at aspects comes from ancient astrology. Hellenistic astrologers practiced with a certain, they had a certain way of looking at aspects in their practice that helped them to understand um, subtler dynamics happening when planets make aspects to one another. So, for example, in every planetary aspect, the trine, the sextile, and the square, in those three aspects in particular, there's going to be one of the two planets that is involved in that aspect that has the more dominant influence, almost as though, you can think about it as like the game tag. My girls play this, right? Where one person is chasing, like my Gigi might be chasing Summer, and then they'll stop all of a sudden without anyone telling them to, and then Summer will start chasing Gigi. So there's this natural energy exchange in nature where we have the pursued and the pursuer. We have the victim and the aggressor. And the roles are always changing. And also, you could even just say that we have an active and we have an active and we have a receiver or a receptive. So, for ancient astrologers, within planetary aspect dynamics, the sextile, the trine, and the square are always of one of two natures. One planet will either be in the superior, more dominant influence position, and or the other will be inferior, which means that they'll be the weaker of the two, or the one that is more receptive to the impressions that the other planet is making upon it. So that's the general meaning of superior and inferior. The word superior is not like I'm better than you. It means more like in front versus behind, or above versus below. It has more of a sense of which planet has a more assertive presence within the dynamic. Is that clear so far?
Yeah, so far.
Now, if you have an opposition, the two planets are in a sense on equal ground. That's why the opposition is so powerful. And if you have a conjunction, for ancient astrologers, it wasn't even really an aspect, because aspect implied lines of sight between whole signs and between planets in whole signs. So the concept of a conjunction was not really included in the aspect family. It had its own unique meaning and status or category, where the two planets are kind of merging or blending with one another. And in opposition, you have more of a sense of the two planets on equal ground, though often the faster moving planet will be the one that will overtake the other one, because when it passes through the opposition, the faster moving planet is going to come onto the superior side. So at any rate, um, this um, this this really makes aspects a lot more unique and nuanced than people generally think. And this is one of the reasons why in my courses I teach people this idea that you don't really need a million aspects. There's a lot of more recently discovered and used aspects in, let's say, from maybe the medieval period, Renaissance period, up to modern period, more and more. different types of aspects have appeared. And no, I'm not trying to take a shot at people who use them, but the more that you learn about ancient aspect theory, the more you realize that there's a lot of sophistication built into these very basic aspects. So that's just a little background, something that I flesh out a lot more in my coursework, where we have 10, 11, 12 hours to spend on aspects. But that's the gist of it so far. We'll define now how to identify which planet would be in the more dominant superior versus inferior position. But before I do that, is that making sense so far, Kat?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I'm also just kind of curious about this being in somebody's. I think we're all going to have this in our chart somewhere,
right?
And maybe you could give us an example of the difference between, let's say, Saturn in the superior square to the sun and vice versa, and how that might look different. Is that possible?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great exercise, great idea. So here you can see on the screen, and let me, before I do so, let me just simplify the chart a little bit. I'm just going to take out the nodes and the part of fortune just to simplify your view even just a little bit more to the traditional 7 planets. It makes it easier to understand the concept. So what you have to do to understand inferior and superior is first find an aspect, right? And it has to be a sextile, trine, or square. So because remember the opposition, they're going to be basically on equal footing with one another, whereas the conjunction, they're blending together. So it's going to be either the left-hand side of a planet or the right-hand side of a planet's trine, sextile, or square. And you can see this, for example, if I just pick any whole sign as a starting place. Let's say it's Pisces. There's going to be 3 aspectual rays to the left of Pisces. Here you got a sextile to Capricorn, a square to Sagittarius, a trine to Scorpio. Then there's the opposition right across the wheel. We already said the opposition is going to be not participating in the inferior versus superior dynamic because the planets are going to be more or less on equal ground. You go to the right-hand side of Pisces in this chart, and you're going to get a sextile to Taurus. You're going to get a square to Gemini, and then a trine to Cancer. So there's 7 aspectual rays that a planet can cast based on the 7 whole sign connections from one sign to another. That's not a mistake. Obviously, there's symmetry there with the number of planets 7 and the number of aspects 7. So at any rate, when you're looking from the standpoint of a planet in any aspectual relationship, you want to see if the aspect is being made to the left of that planet or to the right of that planet, and that will help you understand if the aspect is inferior or superior. For example, let's just take Venus, who is at 27 degrees, and Saturn, who is at 27 degrees. So you can see that they're in a square, almost exactly by degree. So the question becomes, is Venus in the inferior or superior position? If you were to start from Saturn squaring Venus, it would be the same thing. Is Saturn inferior or superior? If you find the answer to one, you found the answer to both. So let's just take Venus as an example. The best way to understand if it's inferior or superior is to draw the opposition across the wheel, right? Just draw that straight line. And imagine that you are in Venus's position looking into the center of the chart. So you're looking in toward this circle. The aspect that Venus is casting, let me draw this over so it's clear. So here's the opposition. And you're Venus and you're looking into the center of the circle. And then the aspect that you're casting is to Saturn at 27 degrees. So the aspectual ray. So the question you ask is, if you're Venus and you're looking into the center of the circle, you're facing in towards the center, is this aspectual ray to Venus's right-hand side or to Venus's left-hand side? And you can see here that this is to Venus's right-hand side. And this would be the same if you rotated this anywhere around the wheel. For example, let me just rotate this a bunch so that we have it like this. If Venus is now at 28 degrees roughly, there's Saturn at 27. Draw the opposition across the wheel. Look into the center of the circle from Venus's position. Is that aspectual ray being cast to Venus's right or left? It's to Venus's right. If the aspectual ray is being cast to the right, ancient astrologers associated that right-hand sidedness with the kind of like the yang tendency, which would be more dominant. And so Venus was said to be in an overcoming or superior square to Saturn, which means that Venus's influence, although it is mingling with Saturn's influence, will be more dominant in the dynamic. So, for example, let's just say here that I'm actually reading this in a natal chart. Let's pretend that this is a natal chart. One interpretation, for example, if I had Saturn in the seventh house, might be that I marry someone who, let's say, because it's the seventh house of marriage, right? So let's say I marry someone who is, let's say, some of the more difficult aspects of Saturn, like controlling, or say very hard or strict or cold or distant. Those would be some of the more like difficult Saturn things you could encounter in a marriage. Does that make sense so far, Kat?
Yep.
Okay. But Venus is in Libra, happens to be the exaltation of Saturn, by the way, but in the fourth house, a place of home, family, dwelling place, and is overcoming Saturn. This might mean that this person, for example, rather than just being a picture of cold, hard Saturn, that you marry an architect. An architect might be someone whose personality includes a lot of the features of Saturn, but here's this overcoming influence from a very strong Venus in her own sign, which means that Saturn, who's a maybe, let's say, more structured and sort of stern planet, is now overcome by the element of beauty, style, class, sophistication. So maybe you have someone who's very disciplined, but they're a designer or they're an architect. So that presence of Venus is overcoming and sort of toning Saturn. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And one of the reasons you might get architect out of this is that Venus is in the fourth house. Now, maybe you marry an architect, maybe you are an architect, right? It could go either way, but more likely with Saturn in the seventh that this would be something describing the home, the living environment, the spouse, maybe something about your own family background with Venus in the fourth. For example, I've seen this exact aspect actually in charts over the past couple of years, obviously as Saturn has been in Capricorn, and I've been doing a lot of Saturn returns for people who are just right 28 to 30 years old. And I've seen overcoming squares from Venus in the fourth to Saturn in the seventh. And a lot of it has had to do with, marrying someone and questions about, am I marrying someone who's the safe pick, right? Am I marrying someone who falls in line with the image or ideal that my family set forth of what marriage and responsibility in the world are supposed to look like? Is this real love? Is it real beauty? Or is there something maybe a little bit vain or superficial about it? And those are questions that could come into play also because, here's a Venus-Saturn combination where questions about authenticity and beauty or control and beauty come into question. And then in these areas, home, family, and marriage, a person has, they're naturally thinking about those things as they're maybe getting married or something like that. So these are just little examples from my practice, but that would be, in this case, Venus overcoming Saturn would also say, maybe there might be something more Saturnine about marriage, relationships, or social life, but then you have this really Venusian aspect that's coloring it and sort of stronger in the mix of Saturn than Saturn is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And would you say that, Venus is kind of sweetening up the Saturn deal,
Yes.
whereas if Saturn was overcoming Venus, Saturn is kind of maybe dampening or making more cold the Venusian side of things?
That's absolutely correct. So let's just let me just show you what this would be like in reverse. So let's go back to Venus in Aries. We can get back there. Let's see. Where is my Venus? Okay, there we go. Okay, so now if we had this picture, can you see Venus in Aries?
Mm-hmm.
So if we now again take Saturn and let's move Venus forward so it's a little bit closer to the exact aspect. So here we have Venus. Basically, there they are in the square again. See, here's Saturn at 28 and there's Venus at 27. Now, let's imagine that we're drawing a line across the chart from Saturn to Cancer. That's the opposition. And then from that line drawn across the wheel, we want to look and say, does this aspect that Saturn's making to Venus happen to Saturn's right or to Saturn's left? Well, it's going to Saturn's right-hand side if we're looking into the circle from Saturn, right? Look into the center of the circle, go to the right-hand side. In this case, Saturn is overwhelming Venus. In this case, For example, I would say, if I were reading this in a chart, I would say, is it possible that duty, responsibility, tradition, control, a more Saturnine home environment overcomes the more carefree, independent Venus in the house of marriage, right? So in that sense, Saturn is going to overcome Venus and have a little bit more dominant effect over Venus. And that changes how you read the dynamics in this case between home and marriage.
Got it. And I just noticed that, we're tracing that back. So that was like in March of this year. Is it something that could be useful to somebody to trace back that story between Saturn and Venus, let's say from the conjunction of Saturn and Venus in their lives?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that would be a level of detail that I would say most clients that I have are not going to be interested in because they probably don't study astrology that in depth. But people who study and track transits, you can absolutely track out the conjunctions from any, synodic cycles between any planets and watch the exchange of inferior versus superior qualities. If you journal and track it out, you'll notice a whole story that unfolds between Venus being more dominant and Venus being more submissive or receptive. And it's really interesting to follow that as Venus's phases also change. For example, here you have Saturn dominating Venus as an evening star. There's Venus in the west. Whereas, when we go forward now after Venus is retrograde to where we are currently, now if you back this up just a couple of hours here, you're going to notice that Venus is in the morning star position. So Saturn dominates Venus in the evening in this cycle, whereas Venus dominates Saturn in the morning. And that's interesting because the morning star would give Venus an extra yang emphasis. And so you have a very strong Venus right now. And that's why I've been so insistent in my videos that, the Venusian things will overcome the Saturn things right now. And that's kind of a good promise looking at what other difficult transits we've had.
Yeah. Yeah. I love thinking about that, like the story of the planets throughout the year, at least the faster moving ones.
Yeah, it's really cool to track. So you can do that with any planetary aspect. Just remember, oppositions won't have one superior and one inferior. That's why they're oppositions, because they're more or less in a grudge match, or you could say that they're working in complementary fashion. Either way, it really depends on our, kind of our karma and our consciousness, I guess.
Okay, cool. So I think that's about it for the superior inferior aspects. What about stelliums? So could you explain to us a little bit about what a stellium is and what does it mean to have a stellium in your chart?
It's funny. I just did a reading for a gentleman, and I'm just going to show something that I think is absolutely fantastic. And not many people know about this, but there was a stellium like no other stellium really that happened in February roughly of 1962. And I just want to show people what that looked like. You actually had a few days, if you look at this, there was a few days in the beginning of February 1972 where all of the traditional planets were in Aquarius. And I just did a chart with someone who had the majority of this stellium in place, except for the moon, I think it was. But at any rate, people are like, well, how do you read something like this? It's
a lot of Aquarius.
It's a lot of Aquarius. And here's the thing is that here's my tip for interpreting stelliums. If you have 3 or more planets in one sign in a chart, the first thing to do is to understand that the planets are all going to be speaking very loudly to the topics of that house. So anchor your interpretation first in the topics of the house. For example, if this is my client, I'm looking at a stellium of 3 or more planets. What to speak of the age of Aquarius transit here, but it's in the 9th house. So that's the place of foreign countries. It's the place of long journeys. It's the place of, universities and monasteries and divination and mysticism. It's a religious, spiritual, academic, intellectual house. It has to do with the law and the laws that govern the universe, whether you're, a physicist or a mystic. So when you look at all of those planets in that house, the first and most basic way to ground the interpretation is going to be to give emphasis to the house topics. Then you've got your groundedness. Then you can start to differentiate and parse things out. You can do so on 2 levels. One is to try to synthesize the planets into a statement that more or less incorporates their qualities. The other one would be to differentiate them and break them into parts. For example, Mars in the ninth house is often very analytical and has a scrutinizing mind, is an inquirer, but maybe with a kind of scalpel. Saturn in the ninth house is often disciplined, principled, sometimes dogmatic, very committed or serious when it comes to the mind or beliefs. Mercury is often the quintessential seeker, questioner in the ninth house. The sun is often the image of the priest or the priestess, or the professor or the monk, or someone who has an official degree in law or something like that. Venus in the ninth might be the student of art history, or someone who loves to travel abroad to beautiful exotic locations, or someone who's interested in the marriage between aesthetics and theology or something like that. Jupiter in the ninth house might be the, again, kind of similar to the sun, may have some mantle of greater authority or knowledge, might be the guru. The moon in the ninth house could very easily be associated with dreams and divination and has a more almost prophetic quality to it, or sometimes may involve the background of the family karma in regard to religion or education. Now, I can break those down really, really quickly, just in a, and then you can try to blend them too. I mean, it's really hard with this amount of planets to like blend them. But let's just say that you had Mercury, Saturn, and Mars. If you have Mercury, Saturn, and Mars, then you want to find a way of blending them. This is going to be a serious, inquisitive, disciplined, curious, but highly analytical and sharp-minded quality. So you got serious and disciplined Saturn, sharp and cutting, analytical and curious, math, science, people who know tax code, lawyers or attorneys who have to slice and dice in the courtroom with verbal or oratorical skills. So you pair the planets together and blend them, and that would be the other approach. So that's how I would recommend approaching stelliums. Ground it in the house. Get that as your primary emphasis. That might be your starting place if you can't do the rest yet. But then differentiate the planets one at a time within the house, and then this next level would be to find creative ways of synthesizing them. For me, in the beginning, I had to use a Word document and write things down so that I could get them out. Now I've done it so much that it comes very quickly.
And what about saying, because to me, it's like, well, they're all in Saturn's domicile. So would you give Saturn a bit of an emphasis in that, like, they're all going to be kind of answering to Saturn?
Yeah, you could go there's two ways of doing that. I mean, in the ancient astrology, it's going to be a bit less about Aquarius and a bit more about Saturn. The ruling planet has more of the power, but it's an Aquarian kind of Saturn, not a Capricornian Saturn. So Aquarius could also modify that a little bit. For example, it's airy, it's fixed. It's related to, Ganymede, the water bearer constellation. There's different elements of myth and metaphor that could come in through the sign as well. I find that those are useful in terms of embellishing the description, not in terms of anchoring it. Because in ancient astrology, the sign is really not what makes it. It's more about the planet and the house, for sure. So it's a Saturnine kind of ninth house, though. But it's not just. There's so many planets in this example in that chart, that though they're toned by Saturn, I wouldn't want to make the whole thing just about Saturn. I would want to try to emphasize really how rich and diverse this person's ninth house emphasis is going to be.
Yeah. I think there's a similar Aquarius stellium in the early 90s, is it?
There might be.
Does that ring a bell?
I'm thinking of maybe that was Capricorn, because there would have been, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. But I'm thinking about, when Saturn was in the early 90s, I believe. Let's just see. Here's a big stellium that would have happened in Capricorn. I think it was right around here. It's pretty close. But you had, the other thing was if you put in the outer planets in the early 90s, you had Uranus and Neptune, right? So then if a lot of people think of this stellium in the early 90s in Capricorn, we've had a big stellium in the past year, in Capricorn. So it'll be nice to see. If there's ever a time to understand the nuances and differences between Capricorn and Aquarius when it comes to Saturn's personality, it's right now, because you're going to see this huge shift of Jupiter and Saturn into Aquarius coming up in December.
Yeah. Okay, one last question about the placement of planets in a chart, and that is when you see a lot of planets, actually like this chart right now, where things are on the upper half of it. versus the lower half, and what might that tell you about the person or their karma?
Sure. So if you're in ancient astrology, the general distinction is going to be spirit above and let's say matter, but also the word fortune below. So spirit would be the realm of the soul and the gods and mind, and action is a result in the ancient sense. It goes from subtle to gross. So in other words, our actions in the flesh are dictated by spirit, something that's not embodied in the typical material sense. And that's consciousness. And that's why I would say, like sometimes scientists say we don't really know where consciousness is. Actually, they're saying now consciousness isn't like in your brain. Like a lot of people think consciousness is somehow in your brain, and they're saying no, actually it's not that simple. Where is consciousness? We don't know. It's a ghost in the machine. So that's the spirit side of things. And in a general sense, that realm belongs to the sun and to this idea of higher dimensions of thought or consciousness. But there's some differentiation between good and bad there too. The 12th house was called the house of bad spirit. The 11th was called the house of good spirit. And you also have the 9th house called God, which was the joy of the sun. On the bottom, you have the 5th house is the house of good fortune and the joy of Venus. And the 6th house is called bad fortune and the joy of Mars. The 3rd house was called goddess and was the joy of the moon. So the underworld has a lot more to do with, you could say, mundane things in a sense, everyday circumstances, things that don't feel like they're in your control, things that connect you to village, tribe, city, group, family, as well as perhaps some things that might be more unconscious, as matter and fortune were generally thought to be slightly more unconscious, but also the underworld and things that are perhaps unseen or hidden or occult in some ways. Whereas the upper world of the spirit is going to be, in a general sense, more about intentionality, sort of the realm of intentions, desires that exist in a sense prior to embodiment or manifestation. There's also in the top half a sense of action in the world, out in the world, in the visible sphere. So those are some distinctions, but my honest commentary on this is that I wouldn't place a large amount of emphasis on this in practice, because it could tell you, for example, if I saw someone with a chart like this, that they're going to be a little bit more outer world focused, but unless there's a huge and obvious emphasis on one hemisphere versus the other, I don't usually give it a lot of weight in my readings, because if it's pretty well spread between the two, then I don't find that it's going to make or break or give me any particularly unique insight. But this would be an example of where it might, because it's so upper focused.
So, and like people talk about, I don't know, they call them like bowls or like different names
shapes,
for having
kites, and all of that.
But not even about aspects, is it? It's like just having
shapes in the chart.
Yeah, and is that just quite a recent phenomenon?
Yeah, that would be like a really recent modern phenomenon. I find that it's a bit like looking at shapes in the clouds, where people say, "Do you see the rabbit?" And I'm like, I see Donald Duck, or something else. Like I see something totally different. So I'm not sure. I personally don't give a lot of credence to the different shape patterns of charts. Whereas I find that if you press anyone and say, "Well, what does that really mean?" Well, can you give me a specific delineation and show me 5 examples where the exact same kind of thing is present? That any examples that I've ever seen given are very generic and don't feel to me like specific or concrete enough examples of the shape or the interpretation of the shape to be valid. For example, someone might have a big bowl or something, and someone goes, "Well, look, they're a healer," or they went through so much. It's because they have a bowl, and you're like, well. If it doesn't make sense,
I just really like food. I just really like bowls of food.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I'm not trying to be a jerk, but like if it doesn't make sense to me, I can't get into it. And for kites and all of these things, like I've seen a huge amount of emphasis being given to these things without very clear explanations of where this comes from, why it's used, and what specifically it tends to point to. So I don't pay a lot of attention to them for that reason. If I saw something like that, more and more of something like that, I would pay attention. So I'm not saying it couldn't happen at some point. Maybe there are these chart patterns that are very specific. Maybe ancient astrologers had paid attention to them and we just haven't discovered texts in which they did, so who knows? But at this point, I'm like, I don't pay attention to chart patterns as much as I do planets and houses, rulerships, dispositorships, aspects, dignities. There's so much there already with the basics that I'm usually, it's like Stephen Forrest once said, I'm constantly trying to tell the chart to shut up because it's saying so much,
Nice.
So I don't really need a lot more to get tons out of the chart already.
Yeah. All right. I think that was really helpful. And that's all I've got on my questions. Okay,
very good. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. If you have questions, feel free to email them to us. Put questions in the subject line. info@nightlightastrology.com. Otherwise, leave them here in the chat box. Kat collects them. We make these episodes from time to time. We hope you enjoy them. That's it for today. We have some more good stuff coming up, so stay tuned for more soon, and be sure to check Kat's work out at thecreativeintrovert.com. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.